Thank you, Javier. I'll just take a few seconds of your time. I'm Cindy Chandler from US, and I'm a member of the IMBER Data Management Committee. I'll be here all week, along with Alberto Piola, I don't see him in the audience, who is the current chair of the Data Management Committee. We're available to help answer any questions that you might have about data management in general, or getting your project registered as an IMBER endorsed project, or maybe uploading metadata project information to the IMBER data portal that's available. As with most things, the first step is always the hardest, but if you've been wanting to try those things, you just have some general questions about that, we're here to help you, or any other data management related questions. I was reminded this morning, I think one of the things that's changed is people know how to manage data for their own projects, but when you start doing it for interdisciplinary work, or thinking about that bigger picture that we were reminded by Margaret this morning that KK Lu thought was so important, it changes the way you handle the data and the expectations for making those data available. And that's when I think a lot of the new questions come in. So we're here all week. We have a room down the hallway on the way to the workshop rooms. I don't know what the name of it is, but it's labeled. And it's on the left as you go from here toward the breakout rooms next after the plenary. Thanks very much. Thank you, Javier.
Thank you, Cindy. Our next keynote speaker is Professor Icarus Allen. He's a research scientist at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK, where he's head of science for marine ecosystem models and predictions. And his research focuses on marine ecosystem modeling and is involved in a number of NERC and European Community FP7 projects. In general terms, the focus of his work has been the coupled physical biochemical modeling at shelf seas, including ecosystem response to multiple drivers, both climate and anthropogenic, development of global shelf sea ecosystem models, and the processes modeling of climatically active marine biogases. So he's going to talk us about integrated modeling of ecosystem responses to climate change and anthropogenic pressures. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. I'm going to say a little bit about my view of integrated modelling and how it works and things we perhaps should be doing, or indeed things we perhaps shouldn't be doing. I'm going to talk you through a few examples of stuff that's been done to address some of these problems for a number of projects that are here, and for those co-authors who are on various bits of work who are in the audience, I thank them for their contribution and apologise here and now if I misrepresent you. Okay, so I think the starting point is this kind of schematic. It's a very old diagram which goes back to this project, which was a Framework 7 project I coordinated, Marine Ecosystem Evolution in a Changing Environment, which at the time was set up to really try and address this question of how do you take a marine ecosystem from end to end, including going from ocean physics through plankton all the way up to the fish, and how do we perturb it with different drivers and work out what might be going on in the future. And this was the sort of schematic that we were working from, where we've got a food web with interactions and connectivity. And then we were challenged with looking at the consequences of a bunch of drivers. So there were climate-related things like temperature, increasing CO2, changes in stratification and currents impacting on the system, and then more direct anthropogenic impacts such as eutrophication or fishing. Okay, so we were looking at a holistic way of trying to get these together, and a lot of that involved building models. And what I'm really going to show is sort of some of the approaches we've got to doing this, is both building modelling tools and then thinking about how we can look at how the system has evolved in the past and goes forward into the future. And I think, I think just sort of picking up on the points and the questions at the end of William's talk, because I think it's quite important, I think, to think about how we use these models. And for me, when we're looking at projecting things in the future, yes, you can make some quantitative projection but it is, at the end of the day, only one of any number of possible futures. And as many people have pointed out, there's always going to be a lot of uncertainty, no matter how much effort you put into quantifying parameter uncertainty or boundary condition uncertainty or any of the other levels of uncertainty. And there was uncertainty of propagating information up trophic levels and everything else. But what you can get from the models is also the understanding of how the system feeds back on itself and how the system responds. And actually, to me, if we really want to apply this stuff in a management context, we want to apply it to governance, we want to apply it to all these social human issues, as much as anything, it's us understanding how the system works, how it responds, how it feeds back, when it might break. And it's taking this information you get from the models and combining it with expert knowledge and using it to address questions for the future is really the way forward. And I don't think we should ever get overly hung up on the absolute quantitative outputs. Okay, so that's my contentious statement for the morning, and I shall move on. Modelling allows us to describe the system and how it might evolve. We're building some sort of numerical schematic of the system, which is obviously simplification of the real world, but they allow us to play. They allow us to look at the pressure-state relationship and explore the dynamics. Effectively, you build a numerical model, you can poke it with a numerical stick and see what happens. And that's actually the beauty of modeling, really, is that you can you can explore parameter space, you can do things that you can't do, or it's much harder to do with models, with experiments and manipulations of the real world. You can take risks, you can push things outside the boundary of observation, you can see where the system breaks. And that's, for me, that's the real beauty of doing this kind of integrated modelling, is to get a real feeling for how the system might evolve and why it's important. And we can use them to assess risks and all sorts of things. We can make quantitative announcements, but really it's the system dynamics is the crucial thing. And if nothing else, that's the message. We build these things from the bottom, this is a schematic of the model system we use in Plymouth, but just treat it as generic. On one side, we generally have models of physical processes, including mixing, stratification, so forth. And on the other side, we have some model of ecosystem biogeochemical processes, which can go, in this case, from plankton and zooplankton and the cycling of nutrients, but can go, in the case of something like Atlantis, all the way up to fish. And there's a whole gamut of models in between. But we're really talking about, I'm really sort of considering these whole system approaches, okay? And we can use these to really think about how we engage with ecosystem services. And this is something that's been, increasingly a challenge for us. Now, what I've got here is, I've got sort of two examples, which actually partly is there because from increasingly talking to ecosystem services people, I'm still struggling to understand their use of jargon and the way they define things, and the fact that they actually keep, to my mind, sometimes seem to redefine things that we as natural scientists seem to have thought were perfectly clear and well-defined in the first place. But hobby horse. But thinking about ecosystem services, we can talk on the left-hand side, we've got components of the marine system the marine ecosystem we're trying to model. And these are things that we can use an ecosystem model to describe, which might be things like habitats, might be trying to model production, decomposition, interactions in food webs, and so forth. At a higher level, we've got the notion of intermediate services, which are things like primary production, nutrient cycling, biological control, carbon sequestration. And these are all things which, to my mind, are to some extent the emergent properties of your ecosystem model. If you're describing the ecosystem, then the biogeochemistry to me is some sort of emergent property that comes from it, as is the food webs. And these things we can use to then look at things like final services. And these kind of things then become informed by the ecosystem model. So we can calculate how large the biological pump might be in the ocean and relate that to climate regulation. Or we can look at changes in habitat and water quality and relate that to the healthy environment and cultural notions. Or we can quite simply work out, how much fish production there might be and what the catches might be. All right? And, this is another way of looking at it, again, from something we did for a project earlier in the year, where we're There's a thing called the Marine Ecosystem Research Programme, which is ongoing in the UK, and we are looking at coastal marine ecosystems around the UK, and it's a mixture of field work, data analysis and modelling, and we're looking at paradigms about trying to understand top-down versus bottom-up control in the system at the highest level, the relationship between biodiversity, spatial and temporal scales, and the connectivity between parts of the system. And we're also looking at biodiversity, function and resilience, how does biodiversity relate to nutrient cycling? And really trying to think here from, what kind of information can we get out of it? And this also comes down to, the different jargon, whereas, as a natural scientist, I call that nutrient cycling. My colleagues in the ecosystem services insist that that's bioremediation. And this is, one of the important things is actually understanding each other's lingua franca. We can look at food provision, which generally in terms of fisheries. We can look at climate regulation and outputs. We can look at these, what they call biological checks and balances, which to me is really the response to the food web and changes in community structure. And I'm going to use this as a little framework to show some of the things that we can do with these kind of models and so on. Now this is an example showing, this is sort of follows a little bit of the kind of thing that William was showing earlier, but this is some climate projections of the North Atlantic using a biogeochemical model, and we've used this to calculate changes in fish habitat by extracting descriptors of fish habitat, running them through a self-organizing map, and then we can create these different biomes. And what's most notable is between the present day and the end of the century is you get very clearly see the disappearance of these high Arctic or high latitude biomes as things move forward, which is something that seems to me intuitively sensible and possibly provides useful information for things to think about. We've also undertaken work, this is through a project called Quest Fish, and again, some of my co-authors are in the audience, where we actually looked for a range of large marine ecosystems, coastal marine ecosystems, at trying to scale from physics to fish, firstly by running coastal shelf seas models under climate change of a number of regions around the globe, extracting information from these and then using these to derive fisheries and fish models, size spectra models and so on, and we use this to determine changes in fish and fish catch and then use that to relate it to the vulnerability of different societies to changes in fish catch. And these are the kind of results we get from running our coastal models, so we get our increases in temperature, changes in primary production, fisheries production, and the potential change in fisheries yield as a consequence. And here we're looking then to relate this to the vulnerability of different nations and their dependency on fish. Okay? But it's really just to give a sense of the kind of things we can do, even if it's as a thought experiment as to how you can relate these things together and get useful information. And again, I think the important thing here is to focus on what it tells us about the system. And, it's to look at these things with the glass half full, I think, not to get, because I think if you get overly hung up on all the uncertainty in the system, you can sort of end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Right? That's as a personal view, and actually by running it through the system, it helps you to think about how the system might evolve. And that's the most important thing that comes out of it. And I think if you get, as I said, you get overly hung up with the uncertainties and everything else, I think you can get sort of lost in a morass of uncertainty and end up not learning anything at all. But that's a personal view. We can use these kind of things. We can use data assimilation. I mean, here's an example of using data assimilation to run reanalysis of the UK shelf assimilating chlorophyll, which allows us to look at make estimates of the air-sea carbon fluxes and the P-R ratio around the UK and the shelf. But more importantly, because we use an ensemble method to also quantify the range of variability in those things. Which again, I mean, it's important to understand errors and range of variability. It's all part of interpreting it, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. We can look at responses, we can perturb systems, with looking at the impacts of ocean acidification on primary production and what happens potentially if ocean acidification, as is viewed, enhances primary production, with and without feedbacks. And we see particularly increases in production around large parts of the shelf. It's amplified, and this shows quite a lot of seasonal variability. And again, this shows the value of using high-resolution models, shows the value of using coupled ecosystem models, and they give you possible futures and things to think about. But they're always, they should be viewed as things to question as well. They're not fact, they're models. Right? Where are we? Pointing at the wrong thing. I mean, a further example, again, this is something from the MEIS project, is, coming a look at this idea of biological checks and balances, is this notion of trophic amplification, where we're looking at the relationship between the changes in one trophic level. In the examples we've got here, phytoplankton against a lower trophic level phytoplankton against a higher trophic level zooplankton, and looking at the relative change between the two as to whether we're getting amplification, positive amplification, or positive attenuation, negative amplification, negative attenuation, all of which are indicative of bottom-up control, or indeed whether we're looking at top-down control of grazing, either through the release or increase of grazing pressure. And as part of the MEIS project, we looked at a variety of coastal seas, each one with a different model, unfortunately. So they're all different physics, they're all different biology. But we can, from this, at least at a basin scale, at the scale of each basin, get an idea of which regions you have trophic amplification in. Now, the big outlier here is the Barents Sea. But you can see that there's quite a lot of variability between different regions. You've got the Baltic up here and so on. But it's also, it's a way of helping us think about how the system might evolve and whether or not we're seeing, how the information and how energy is propagated up and down the system. Now, here's an equivalent. It's on the same paper with using a global model. This is Laurent Bop's IPSL Pisces model, run into the future, and here we've got the change in zooplankton biomass, change in phytoplankton biomass, change in zooplankton biomass, and here we are, there's a map of the global amplification, and what we're actually seeing is in large chunks of the tropics and subtropical ocean, we're seeing negative amplification in that we're getting much less propagation of energy from the phytoplankton to the zooplankton, whereas we're seeing positive attenuation and positive amplification in high latitudes, and a sort of mixed response between. I mean, okay, this is just a one-off example and done with one model, and I'm sure if you run these results with a different biogeochemical model, you may get some slightly different responses, depending on how things like phytoplankton and zooplankton are parameterized. But again, it's useful for helping us think about how the system might respond. And actually the response to this is to look at it with our expert knowledge and ask the question, well, do I believe this? Or how much of it do I believe? Do I believe any of it? Right? Sorry, where are we? There we go. I mean, a further example, and this is, is thinking about the impacts of climate change on regional scales, and also at the same time, other direct anthropogenic changes. And again, this is some work we did with MEIS, where we actually took our model of the UK shelf here, this region, with URSEM, and we ran it with a bunch of scenarios simultaneously. So we're looking at we've got a climate change scenario, and A1B was a moderately large climate change. I can't remember what that translates to now in RCP currency, but it's a fairly big climate stick. Okay. We're also looking at reducing the nutrient loads in terms of the riverine phosphate, and we're also looking at a 50% reduction in benthic trawling, so removing the benthic ecosystem. I mean, it's a slightly arbitrary selection of things that we chose, mostly because it was a basis of the available forcing functions we had. And so on. Okay. Available forcing functions we had to do this, but again, to some extent, it's a sort of numerical thought experiment, but it does produce some quite interesting results. And running it out for a time slice to 2030, 2040, we can look at the changes in different properties from primary production through to nutrients, benthic biomass, and so on. And basically the analysis we've done with the present day is to determine where climate dominates the change. And it's not telling you whether it's positive or negative, it's just telling you that there's a statistically separable change, or where the alternative driver dominates. And in some ways it's not surprising in that there's a lot of sensitivity to changes in nutrient load along the European coast where you've got lots of big rivers. The benthic biomass is unsurprisingly very sensitive to changes in demersal trawling. And that but the climate variability is quite variable according to different parts of the ecosystem. And actually, in our model world, it seems that the zooplankton are far more sensitive to the climate variability than the phytoplankton or the primary production or the phytoplankton, which again is, that again is something you need to think through as to why. I mean, if this is correct, it's perhaps actually useful that we should think a little bit more about using zooplankton as a proxy for climate change more than phytoplankton. But, I'd leave that for people to debate as to fact. Now, moving forward, I mean, that's a sort of an example of some of the things we can do and some of the things we can deliver. But the real challenge is to build integrated modelling systems, and the kind of things we need to put in these systems. I mean, we need to include abiotic processes with a spatial temporal component. We need to be able to describe the cellular ecosystem, looking at rates and function and food web interactions, the biogeochemical end of it. And at some point, we need to be able to focus on integrating higher trophic levels, possibly with a view on species and life history. And out of this, we then need to be able to extract information which is translatable into, I use the generic term of ecosystem services, but information that is translatable for other people to use in an applied manner, societally relevant manner. Okay? And certainly in MEIS, the approach we used was very much, starting with experiments and observations, looking at meta-analysis, develop model parameterizations, new model systems. Scenario definition is a crucial stage, simulations and synthesis to provide then outputs of information. In this case, we were looking at management strategy evaluation and indicators, but it could be other things, and ultimately looking to transfer knowledge. But, if we're thinking about the sort of integrated modelling, this is the process of how we need to do this. This is a diagram some colleagues of mine at PML put together about trying to link models and data. And while it's possibly a little complicated to follow here, the principle of it really, it's the important stages of these interactions. There's the interaction at the top from taking your empirical knowledge of the process to getting your basic conceptual numerical model. There's the feedback here of requesting information in terms of how to parameterize that model. And then there's a really important feedback here in terms of, trying to constrain relationships and validate models. And if we are looking to build integrated modeling systems, there is a tendency, or has been historically a tendency, it's less so now, for the modelers to exist in their own private little world. And the time it takes to get information, new knowledge about the system through into models, there's always seems to me to be of the order of a decade or something between somebody making an observation and it making its way through to a model, and then to make its way through to the IPCC, it probably takes at least another decade. And it's really, this whole process needs to be tightened up and needs to be much more integrated. And and it comes back to, it was the point that Sylvia made, actually, she had a slide about cooperation. And while she was talking about cooperation amongst fishing communities in Mexico, most of those points about cooperation actually apply to the development of integrated modelling. And if we're going to do this kind of stuff, that social side of it and how we interact with each other and how we share with each other, how we play nicely, is the only way we actually get this stuff to work. It doesn't matter how anything else, if we don't have the right social interactions and cooperation, you can't do this kind of work. And again, this is a similar sort of idea, showing building models around data and process from going from conceptual modelling to mathematical models and the key points where we need to interact with data, which is really around calibration, parameterization, and testing and validation. And this is all about getting models with some baseline integrity that you can demonstrate to people that at least the component of the model represents the system, and we understand, at least to some extent, what it describes and also what it doesn't describe. Because it's as important to know what your model can do, it's also important to know very clearly what it can't do. Avoid overselling. Are we? Thank you. This is a hobby horse of mine, really, but it's trying to understand this relationship between biogeochemistry and ecosystems. And again, I think if we're looking at integrated modelling and systems, we have a sort of hierarchy. At one end, we've got very basic chemical process and biophysical processes. There's a sort of intermediate step here, which relates to trophic interactions and stress responses and biophysical interactions here. And at the other end, we've got the sort of ecosystem structure, is how you actually describe organisms in a generic sense and how you relate trait and trade-offs and size scaling. And really, we need to start to have model systems that can are integrative and scalable and can look at relating these two processes together. Where does biogeochemistry start? Where does ecology stop? There's a continuum there, but you have to be able, in some ways, describe all of those systems. And increasingly important to this is also the ability to capture stress responses, because if we're interested in looking at physiological dynamics and climate and biodiversity and all these questions, it's very important we have things that can understand, that can capture stress responses. But we're looking towards building flexible processes. We're looking at a conceptual approach which uses standard organisms. And at least in Plymouth, we're exploring it through using a framework whereby we can build scalable ecosystem models at runtime, so you can make them as simple or complex as you want, and they're all traceable to each other. And we can represent this in a modular Lego form, which upset my colleague Jorn Bruggeman's children when he borrowed the Lego. And sorry, I keep pointing at the wrong one. And this allows us then to scale from very simple NPZD type models to very complicated models. And we're starting to explore the use of these systems, and in the next 2 or 3 months, we should be releasing this into the wild. Okay, on top of that, we need good physics. It's very important that we're able to resolve the scales, and this sort of shows a cascade of some of the scales that are currently used. At the Earth system model, we're moving to 1 to 1/4 degree now. We're looking at regional models at these sort of scales of 0.1 degree, a few kilometres, and certainly the ambition in the UK now is to move down to a 1/60th of a degree for our coastal modelling. And you can see how much difference at least it makes to the definition of things like the shelf current and so on. Although, of course, demonstrating that that's real presents another challenge in itself, and we have to deal with the computational cost. We have to define whether our models are fit for purpose, so we need to understand our scenarios. We need a range of models to understand the structural and parameter uncertainty, and we need to understand the natural variability of the system to be able to relate it to change and understand what's natural and what isn't. And again, I think I'm running out of time, but this is an example just showing the response of different drivers, climate drivers, to primary production response to different climate drivers, which basically shows that around the UK shelf it's most sensitive to the air temperature. But this is the kind of thing we need to be cognizant of when trying to understand the system and the responses. And actually this kind of analysis of sensitivity to different drivers is really important in terms of interpreting the outputs of your model systems. Okay, it's very obvious this. We're looking to define climate forcing scenarios over a range of temporal scales, and on top of this, we're looking to put various anthropogenic perturbations, and you can make that list as long or short as you like. And perhaps here, I think this is the final slide. This is sort of something I got from some climate discussions a while ago and thought about. But we have models, and the key thing about the model is ascertaining what is the useful, usable information from the model, which can be highly quantitative. It can be, a bit more subjective. It can be learn what you've learned about the system. At the same time, we also have expert knowledge, and really the interpretation of models is tempering the two. And this was an attempt to put a few things in a sort of space of, where we have good knowledge, we have good expert knowledge, or low expert knowledge, and trying to map different processes. This was a subjective thing I did a few years ago. I'm not sure we should really worry about debating exactly where the circles are, but it's really to think about, where things fit. I mean, eutrophication is something where I think on the whole we have quite a lot of expert knowledge of the outcomes, and at a first order level the models are quite good at predicting it. I would argue commercial fishing is perhaps something where we have more expert knowledge than we have model skill. And then there's this interesting situation over here where you have things like pollutants and invasive species, where you actually might get stuff from the stuff you don't know about. The left field, the chemical industry is constantly making new chemicals, new toxins. There's always something else that's going to come in from this area. But I just put it there as a sort of final slide to help you, when we're using models, these integrated models, to actually focus on thinking about what is the useful information from them. And it's a big challenge. How do you get terabytes into numbers that are useful? Okay? I think that's about it. Management strategy evaluation. I mean, this is, again, it's a sort of schematic of the whole process, pulling us through to experiments into an operational phase. I think I've run out of time, so I will thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Icarus. We have time just for a very quick question.
Yeah. There's somebody up there, I think.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. When you were presenting your results, I just realized in my own institute, we have people working in currents, pollution, phytoplankton, zooplankton, but we don't talk each other. So it's very interesting how we could get more information if we could pull that, and I find very attractive this information system that you mentioned, because I think can also be good to show to managers or other users in a more comprehensive way. So I don't know how, well, it just caught my attention because I really would like to grab my colleagues and tell them, this is something that we could do. I don't know if you have a web page or how we could get more information from these systems that could be useful for contexts like ours.
Well, I mean, there's a number of publications around this work, and there's a number of project reports and things that I can pass on to you showing what we did in various EZ projects. But I guess the other way is just to, really is to talk to people. I mean, the secret to this, as much as anything about scientific understanding or anything of the individual knowledge of people, is the point you made. It's about collaboration. It's about how you communicate and share with each other. You can't do this kind of integrated modelling unless everybody shares, everybody plays nicely, because we're all dependent on each other. And it's as much a social challenge to do this kind of work. I mean, in fact, pulling together the MEIS project, the social challenge of getting people to collaborate was the bigger challenge than actually doing the science and doing the hardcore modelling and coupling things together and running the simulations. But it does pay off, and it allows you to do stuff you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And that's exactly the same trade-off as your fishing communities have on the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay, thank you very much. We're moving to the next presentation, also about modeling.
Good.
And our next key speaker is